You want to know how it started. Everyone always wants to know how it started, as if the beginning could explain the wreckage, as if there's a single sentence you could point to and say, there, that's the line she shouldn't have crossed. There isn't one line. There's never just one. There's 100 small ones, each so faint you don't notice you've stepped over it until you look back and see how far you've walked from where you were supposed to stay. So I'll tell you the truth, and you can decide for yourself where the story turns into a warning. My name doesn't matter. Call me what you like, the girl in the third row, the one who underlined too much, the one who should have known better. I was 20 years old in my third year at Ravenswood, a university old enough to have its own ghosts, built from the kind of grey stone that makes even sunlight look like it's trespassing. I'd chosen it for the library, if you can believe that, 4 floors of a building that smelled like dust and rain no matter the season, shelves that groaned when you pulled a book free, like they didn't want to let it go. I understand that feeling better now than I did then. That autumn I enrolled in a seminar called Gothic Literature and the Architecture of Desire, taught by a professor famous for 2 things, never smiling and never repeating a syllabus. I took it because a friend told me the reading list alone was worth the tuition. Wuthering Heights, Rebecca, Carmilla, The Turn of the Screw, novels where wanting something is always described like a haunting, like a disease you catch from a house instead of a person. I didn't yet understand how literally that would apply to my own life. I should tell you a little about Ravenswood itself, because the place mattered almost as much as the people in it. It was the kind of campus built by people who wanted their ambitions to outlast them in stone. Ivy allowed to run wild up the sides of buildings that had stood since, before the country had finished deciding what it wanted to be, hallways that narrowed unexpectedly into little alcoves, a chapel no one used any more except for the acoustics, which made even ordinary footsteps sound like they were being confessed rather than simply walked. My friends complained about the cold, about the ancient plumbing, about professors who still assigned actual bound books instead of PDFs, but I loved it precisely for its refusal to modernize, for the sense that the whole place was holding its breath around some older, unspoken rule it wasn't in a hurry to update. I think, looking back, that I was primed for what happened to me before I ever set foot in that classroom. A girl who already loved buildings with secrets, given a syllabus about houses that keep them, and then handed, as if by design, a person who felt like the human version of exactly that kind of house. The professor didn't run the small discussion sections herself. That fell to her graduate teaching assistant, and his name was Julian Ashworth, and I want to describe him carefully, because the way I first saw him is the way I still see him, underneath everything that came after. He was standing at the front of a room that held maybe 15 of us, sleeves pushed to his elbows, a paperback so worn the spine had gone soft as cloth. He didn't introduce himself with charm. He introduced himself with a question. What does it mean, he asked, that every Gothic heroine falls in love with the one man in the house she's been warned about? And then he waited, actually waited, while we sat there in the silence he didn't seem to mind at all. Most people fill silence because it makes them nervous. He used it like a scalpel. He was maybe 26. Dark hair he didn't bother taming, the kind of jaw that looked carved rather than grown, and eyes so pale a grey they read as unreadable, like weather you couldn't predict. He wasn't handsome in the easy, forgettable way. He was handsome in the way that makes a room slightly more dangerous to sit in. I want to be honest about something, because this story only means anything if I'm honest. I noticed him the way you notice a knife left out on a counter, not because I wanted to touch it, because some animal part of you clocks the sharp thing in the room before your conscious mind catches up. I didn't think anything would happen. There were rules, actual, written university rules. about teaching assistants and the students in their sections, rules posted in the same handbook that told you not to plagiarize and not to bring pets to the dormitories, rules that existed, I assumed, because someone before me had already made this mistake, and the institution had decided to legislate against my particular kind of stupidity in advance. I remember reading that clause once, early in the semester, out of nothing but idle curiosity, and feeling a strange little thrill that had nothing to do with him at all. Just the shape of a forbidden thing, the architecture of a locked door before you even know what's behind it. That's the part no one tells you about wanting something you shouldn't. It doesn't arrive all at once, obscene and obvious. It arrives disguised as curiosity, as an assignment, as a perfectly reasonable, perfectly professional email asking to discuss your last essay during office hours, because you got a B+ and you've never gotten a B+ in your life, and you want to know why. His office was in the English building's basement, a windowless room with a radiator that clanked like something trying to get free. Shelves so overloaded with books that he'd had to stack the overflow on the floor in leaning towers that looked one sneeze away from collapse. When I knocked, he was reading with his boots up on the desk, and when he saw it was me, he took his time putting the boots down, like he wanted me to know I'd interrupted something, without ever making it feel like an accusation. "Sit," he said, and gestured at the chair across from him with the same paperback he'd carried into that first class. I never saw him without a book in his hand. I used to think it was affectation. Later I understood it was armor. He'd written more on the margins of my essay than I'd written in the essay itself. Small, slanted handwriting, half of it questions, half of it arguments, none of it cruel, all of it merciless. "You write like someone who's afraid of being caught wanting something," he said, tapping one paragraph with his pen. "Every time you get close to an actual claim, you hedge it into safety." "Why?" "I don't know," I said, because I genuinely didn't, and because the honest answer, that I was sitting 3 feet from him and could smell coffee and rain on his sweater, and had lost track entirely of what my essay had even argued, was not an answer I was prepared to give out loud. He looked at me for a moment too long. Then he smiled, the first one I'd seen from him, small and almost reluctant, like it cost him something. "Figure it out," he said. "You're smarter than the paper you turned in. I'll know when you stop hedging." I left that office with my heart going like I'd run somewhere, and I hadn't moved from the chair the entire time. I want you to understand that for weeks, actual weeks, nothing happened that a stranger could have pointed to and called wrong. I went to section. I raised my hand. I argued with him about whether Heathcliff was a romantic figure or simply a case study in what obsession does to a person who's never been taught any other way to love, and he argued back like my opinion actually mattered to him, which was its own kind of intoxication, being disagreed with by someone who clearly thought you were worth the effort of disagreement. We talked about Rebecca one week, about the unnamed narrator who spends the entire novel haunted by a dead woman she never met, terrified of becoming her, and terrified of never measuring up to her memory at the same time. He said something in that discussion I never forgot. He said the tragedy of that book isn't the ghost. It's that the narrator keeps waiting for permission to exist as herself instead of just taking it. He was looking at the whole room when he said it. I've never fully convinced myself he wasn't looking at me. That was the thing about him. Every conversation had a surface and an undertow, and you were never quite sure which one you were actually standing in. We'd be discussing Carmilla, the way desire in that book gets dressed up as horror because the writer couldn't say the true word for what was happening between the two women, and he'd say something like, "Funny how we still do that, dress up wanting someone in the costume of something safer, call it curiosity, call it friendship, call it academic interest," and I would sit there with my pen very still on the page. unable to tell if he was talking about 150-year-old novel or about the exact air between the two of us in that low-ceilinged room. Double meaning, that's the phrase for it, isn't it? Every Gothic novel runs on it. The house is never just a house, the ghost is never just a ghost, the letter left unburned is never just paper. And somewhere in October, I understood that Julian talked to me the same way those novels were written. Every sentence had a second sentence hiding inside it, and he never once made it easy for me to be sure I wasn't imagining the second one. I started staying later after section ended. I told myself it was about the material. I told my roommate it was about my grade. I did not tell her that I had begun choosing what I wore on Thursdays, the day of his office hours, with the kind of care I usually reserved for occasions that mattered, and that some sick, thrilled, guilty part of me knew exactly what I was doing when I did it. Thanksgiving break separated us for a full 10 days, and I hadn't understood before that how much of my week had quietly rearranged itself around the shape of him. Thursday office hours, the hallway outside his section, the particular 5 minutes after class when everyone else filed out, and I found reasons to be last. Home was 2 states away, my childhood bedroom still papered with posters from a version of myself that felt embarrassingly far off. And somewhere on the second night, I gave in and emailed him about a source, something flimsy and academic and entirely unnecessary, and he wrote back within the hour. His email was 3 sentences about the source, and then a 4th that had nothing to do with it at all. Reading Rebecca again on my own this week, he wrote, struck by the line about how the narrator can't picture herself in the present tense, only ever as someone who's already lost the thing she's currently holding. Made me think of a student who overthinks by nature. Hope your break is good. I read it 4 times before I let myself understand what it was, not a comment on the reading, but a confession dressed as one, the same trick the whole syllabus had been teaching me all semester. I wrote back something equally disguised, a line about how maybe the narrator's problem wasn't overthinking but underclaiming, that she never let herself use the word mine about anything, not the house, not the husband, not even her own jealousy, and hit send before I could talk myself out of it, and then sat on my bed with my phone in both hands like it might do something dangerous if I let it out of my sight. He didn't write back again until the last night of break, and when he did, it was 1 line. Come back safe, he wrote. Section isn't the same without someone in the room who actually reads the margins. I must have read that sentence 30 times on the drive back to campus, turning it over the way you turn over a coin you're not sure is real gold or only gold-colored, needing it to be the first thing and terrified it was only ever the second. The first time he touched me, it was nothing. That's what makes it the kind of memory that doesn't let you sleep, how small it was. I'd brought him a passage I wanted to argue about, some line from The Turn of the Screw, and I'd underlined it so hard the pen had nearly torn the page. And when he leaned over to read where I was pointing, his shoulder came to rest against mine, warm through 2 layers of sweater, and neither of us moved away. We stayed like that, his shoulder against mine, both of us pretending to read a sentence neither of us was actually reading anymore, for longer than either of us could have explained if someone had opened that door. Nice weather, he said finally, which made no sense at all because it was raining, because it had been raining for 3 days straight. And I laughed before I could stop myself, and he laughed too, low and surprised, like he hadn't meant to be funny and was pleased anyway that he had been. There was a discussion, maybe 2 weeks after that I've never fully let go of. We were on The Turn of the Screw, arguing about whether the governess in that story is haunted by real ghosts or by her own denied wanting, dressed up in a costume terrifying enough that she never has to admit what it actually is. Half the class thought the ghosts were real. I said I didn't think it mattered whether they were real, because either way the story was about a woman so unwilling to name her own desire that her mind built her a haunted house to hide it in instead. Julian looked at me for a beat too long across that little seminar table, that particular pale grey stillness in his eyes, and said, "That's the sharpest thing anyone said about this book all semester," in a voice pitched perfectly flat and professional, the kind of flatness that only exists because a person is working very hard to keep something else out of it. After class, he asked me to stay behind, ostensibly to talk about a source for my next paper. He shut the door not all the way, just enough that the hallway noise fell to a murmur, and leaned against the edge of the table instead of sitting behind his desk, which put us closer together than either of us strictly needed to be for a conversation about footnotes. "You really believe that," he said, "about the governess, that we build whole houses to hide from what we want instead of just admitting we want it?" "I think it's easier," I said, "building the house." "Is it working?" he asked, and I understood with a jolt that went all the way down my spine that we were no longer discussing 120-year-old novella at all. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. I gathered my books instead, hands not quite steady, said something about being late for my next class that wasn't remotely true, and left him standing there in a doorway he hadn't opened any wider, watching me go with an expression I spent the whole walk across the quad trying, and failing to stop thinking about. I want to skip ahead a little here, because I could spend an hour just on the almosts, the accumulation of small, deniable moments that, taken individually, meant nothing, and taken together meant everything. I think you already know that feeling, or you wouldn't still be listening. The particular vertigo of wanting someone you are not allowed to want, where every non-event becomes an event, where a hand near yours on a table becomes the loudest thing in the room. There was the department's end-of-semester gathering in the faculty lounge, all lukewarm wine and paper plates of cheese no one was really eating, and Julian had crossed the room to hand me a plastic cup before I'd even reached the drinks table myself, like he'd been tracking my path across the room without meaning to. "Be careful," he said low just for me. "This one's stronger than it looks," and his fingers stayed on the cup a half-second longer than the handoff required, overlapping mine, warm and deliberate, and I understood he wasn't only talking about the wine. There was the Tuesday I dropped my pen under the seminar table, and we both reached for it at the same moment, and our hands closed over it together in the dark space beneath the table where no one else could see, and neither of us moved for 3 full seconds before he finally, silently, let me take it, his eyes never leaving mine the whole time, the rest of the room continuing its discussion of Rebecca, completely unaware that an entire conversation had just happened 3 feet below the table's surface. There was the afternoon in the department hallway when I was leaving as he was arriving, and he held the door for me the way anyone might hold a door, except he held it a full beat too long, long enough that I had to either walk through immediately or acknowledge out loud that something had shifted in the pause, and I chose to walk through, chest tight, aware of him watching me the entire length of the corridor. None of these moments would have meant anything to a stranger who happened to witness them. That was, I think, the particular cruelty and thrill of it, that we were having an entire relationship in plain sight, built out of nothing but timing and proximity, and the small, illegal thrill of 2 people deciding, silently and separately, not to look away first. The night everything actually changed, it was late November, and Ravenswood's campus had gone the particular kind of dark that only happens in old New England towns in late autumn, early dusk, bare trees, streetlights turning the fog gold instead of clearing it. I'd stayed behind after the last section before the holiday break to return a book he'd lent me, a slim, ancient copy of Carmilla with his handwriting crawling through every margin, arguments with the author dead 150 years, Question marks stacked next to paragraphs like he was still hoping the book might answer him back. He was alone in the office, no boots on the desk this time, just him at the desk lamp's little pool of light, and when I set the book down between us he didn't pick it up right away. He looked at me instead, longer than he ever let himself look, and something in his face had stopped pretending to be professional. "You should stop staying late," he said. It wasn't unkind. It was the opposite of unkind. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in 3 months, and it landed like a confession because it was one. "Why?" I said, though I already knew, though I'd known for weeks and had simply refused to make him say it, because as long as neither of us said it out loud, we could both keep pretending we were only talking about books. "Because I think about you when you're not here," he said, "and I'm supposed to be better than that. I could have left then. I want you to know that because it matters. Nobody pushed me into that room and closed the door. I stood there with the rain starting against the basement window, high and small, like the whole world was listening in and didn't approve, and I made a choice with both eyes open. I crossed the 3 feet of ugly linoleum between us and I said, 'Then stop being better than that, just for tonight,' and I watched something in him break loose that he'd clearly been holding onto with both hands for a very long time. He didn't grab for me the way I might have expected, the way it happens in the books we'd spent a semester dissecting. He stood up slowly, like he was giving me every chance to change my mind, like some last responsible piece of him was still hoping I would, and when I didn't move, he reached up and tucked a piece of hair behind my ear with a gentleness that undid me faster than urgency ever could have. "This is a bad idea," he said, so quietly it was almost lost under the rain. "I know," I said, "I mean it. If anyone finds out my program, your scholarship, everything either of us has worked for, I know," I said again, and I meant something different by it the second time. I meant I've already weighed it. I weighed it weeks ago in a hallway when your hand didn't move from that door. I am not asking you to be responsible right now. I am asking you to choose me the way I have already, quietly, stupidly, chosen you." He kissed me like he'd been rehearsing an apology for it his whole life. Careful at first, testing whether I'd pull away, and when I didn't, when I fisted my hand in his sweater instead and pulled him closer, like proximity could somehow make the wrongness of it feel less enormous, the carefulness broke apart into something hungrier, something that had clearly been rationed for months and had finally run out of patience. The desk lamp buzzed. The radiator clanked its useless heat into the small room. Outside, the rain kept falling on a campus that had no idea one of its basement offices had just become the site of a decision neither of us could take back. We didn't do anything reckless that night, if you can call any of it anything other than reckless. We stayed in that office until the building's other lights had gone out floor by floor above us, talking in the low, giddy, disbelieving voices of 2 people who have just done something they've wanted to do for so long that the wanting itself had started to feel like the whole relationship. And now here was the thing itself, more overwhelming and more terrifying than the wanting had ever prepared them for. He held my face in both hands at one point and just looked at me, like he was trying to memorize the exact moment before either of us said something that would turn this into a mistake instead of a memory. "I have to grade your papers," he said eventually, laughing a little, disbelieving. "I am going to have to sit at this desk and grade your papers like nothing happened." "Give me an A," I said, and he laughed for real then, dropped his forehead to mine, said, "God help me, I probably will, and it'll be the least professional thing I've ever done, and it still won't be the least professional thing that happened in this office tonight. You understand, I hope, that from that point forward, everything about my life at Ravenswood had a second meaning layered underneath it, the way our seminar readings always did. Every email he sent about section logistics had a sentence buried in it that was really for me alone. Every time he called on me in class and made his voice as flat and neutral as everyone else's. I could hear, underneath the neutrality, the specific carefulness of someone working very hard not to sound like anything at all, which is its own kind of tell if you're listening for it. We became fluent in a language made entirely of restraint, the deliberate space he left between us in hallways, the way he'd write "see me" after regarding an essay when what he meant was "I miss you," and this is the only sentence I'm allowed to write that will get you into this room. We were careful. I want that on the record because carefulness was its own exhausting, obsessive project, a second education running underneath the real one. We never touched where anyone could see. We met at his apartment, a narrow third-floor walk-up above a laundromat that smelled permanently of fabric softener and old radiator dust, and I learned to leave separately, to wait 20 minutes on his stoop, pretending to check my phone before I let myself walk home a route that avoided the streets where other students might recognize me. I learned to lie fluently and instantly to my roommate, to my friends, to my own mother on the phone, who kept asking in the particular tone mothers use, if there was someone, because apparently I'd started smiling at nothing. There's a particular night from that stretch of winter I keep returning to more than any other, when I try to explain to myself what those months actually felt like from the inside. It had snowed hard enough to close half the town, and I'd trekked to his apartment anyway, boots soaked through, and he'd opened the door before I even knocked, like he'd been watching the street the whole time. He didn't say anything about the weather, or the risk of me being seen crossing campus in a storm bad enough that no one sensible would have been outside. He just pulled me in out of the cold, peeled my wet coat off my shoulders like it was the most natural thing in the world, and pressed his mouth to my temple, my jaw, the cold shell of my ear, murmuring something about how he'd spent the whole storm convincing himself I wouldn't be reckless enough to come, and how relieved and furious he was that I had been. We ended up on the floor in front of the space heater, because the apartment's real heat had never worked properly, wrapped in the quilt off his bed, a stack of books he'd never bothered shelving forming a low, precarious skyline around us. He read to me for a while, not for the class, just for himself, a poem he liked and had never assigned because he said it was too obviously about him to teach it with a straight face. And I lay with my head on his chest, listening to his voice do something low, and unguarded that I never once heard him use in a classroom. At some point the reading stopped mattering more than the space between his voice and my skin, and the rest of that night belongs only to the two of us, the kind of hour you don't narrate so much as carry, quietly, the sound of the space heater ticking, and the snow going soft and endless against the window, both of us learning each other in a way no lecture on longing had ever quite prepared either of us for. I remember, more than any single detail, the feeling of being entirely known by someone for the length of one snowbound night. No hedging, no margins, nothing held back for safety's sake, and how strange and good it was to finally stop building the house the governess built, and just admit, plainly, what I wanted. Afterward, near dawn, he traced one finger along my spine like he was underlining something he intended to come back to, and said, half asleep, "You should stay till the plows come through." I stayed until noon. I told my roommate I'd been snowed in at the library. There's no one, I told her. I was in his bed when I said it, weeks later, his hand tracing absent circles against my spine, and he went very still and quiet at the words, the way you go still when you hear a lie you understand perfectly and can't be angry about, because you're the reason it has to be told. I won't pretend the danger wasn't part of it. I've turned that over more times than I can count since, trying to be honest with myself about which parts of what I felt were really about him, and which parts were about the particular electricity of wanting something the entire institution had explicitly forbidden. I think the honest answer is that they were never separable. Wanting him and wanting the forbidden thing were the same want, twisted together so tightly that I couldn't have pulled them apart even if I'd tried, and for a long time I didn't try very hard. There was a night in December after his last office hours before finals, when he pulled me into that basement office one final time, blinds already drawn from the meeting before, and said against my ear, low enough that even the empty room felt like it shouldn't hear it, "I graded your final essay. You got the A, you earned it fair, if that matters to you. And then, when I go up to submit these grades tonight, I'm going to walk past that classroom and think about the fact that in 11 days you won't be my student anymore, and I don't know what that's going to make me into." "What do you want it to make you into?" I asked, and he didn't answer with words. He answered by kissing me the way he only ever let himself kiss me when the door was locked, and the blinds were down, and the whole ugly machinery of rules and consequences had, for a few stolen minutes, nowhere to reach us. I won't tell you every detail of what those months were like, not because I'm ashamed exactly, though there's plenty to be ashamed of, if shame is the currency you're counting in, but because some rooms are still mine, and I've decided to keep a few doors of my own closed even now, telling this. What I'll tell you is that it was the most intense thing I have ever lived through, before or since. Being wanted by someone who has to want you in secret does something to the wanting. It concentrates it. Every stolen hour felt like it had the weight of 10 ordinary ones, because we both knew without saying it that the whole thing was built on borrowed time, that eventually the semester would end, or someone would notice, or one of us would slip, and the entire fragile architecture we'd built in that basement office and that narrow apartment above the laundromat would come down around us. It came closer to coming down than either of us wanted to admit in February. There was a second-year TA in the same department, a girl named Priya who taught the section next door to his, and who had, I would learn much later, wanted Julian herself the year before and had been quietly, correctly rebuffed. She was the kind of sharp that notices things other people are too kind, or too self-absorbed, to notice. The fact that I was staying unusually late on Thursdays, the fact that Julian's usual brisk efficiency softened by some visible degree whenever I was in a room, the fact that once, in the department lounge, he'd absent-mindedly finished a sentence of mine before I'd said it, the easy, terrifying intimacy of two people who have spent enough nights together to start thinking in each other's rhythms. She cornered me outside the library on a Tuesday, cold enough that our breath hung between us like something either of us might have to eat our words back out of the air. "I know what's going on with you and Ashworth," she said. No preamble, no softness, just the flat, satisfied tone of someone who'd been collecting evidence and was finally ready to spend it. "I'm not stupid, and I'm not the only one who's noticed. I remember the specific, full-body cold that went through me that had nothing to do with the February air. I said the only thing I could think to say, which was nothing at all, which was of course its own confession. "You should be careful," she said, in a voice that could have meant a warning or a threat, and to this day I've never fully decided which one she intended. "He could lose his position over this. You could lose your scholarship. Some things aren't worth what they feel like when you're 20 and in love with your grad student." I didn't tell Julian about that conversation for 3 days, which I'm not proud of, but fear works strangely. It makes you want to hoard the danger yourself, as if not saying it out loud keeps it from becoming real. When I finally did tell him, sitting cross-legged on his bed with my back against the cold wall, watching his face carefully for the moment it would change, he went very quiet, and then he did something I hadn't expected. He didn't panic. He got up, made 2 cups of the terrible instant coffee he kept in the cabinet above a stove that never quite got clean, and sat back down across from me with the particular calm of a person who has already, privately, rehearsed the worst version of this conversation many times before. I've thought about this ending badly since the day it started, he said. I want you to know that. I never once let myself believe this was going to be simple or safe or something I'd get to keep without cost. I made a choice anyway. I'd make it again. Would you? I asked, because some cruel, frightened part of me needed to hear him say it without hesitation, needed the reassurance more than I needed the actual answer. Every time, he said, and reached across the space between us to lace his fingers through mine, and the certainty in his voice did more to steady me than any promise about our safety could have. There was a night not long after that conversation with Priya when the danger stopped being theoretical. I'd left his apartment later than I meant to, past midnight, the street empty enough that I let myself walk it without the usual careful detour. And halfway across the quad I heard my name, not shouted, just said, in the particular tone of someone who's surprised to see you and hasn't yet decided what to do with the surprise. It was a girl from my dorm, Meredith, red-eyed and windswept from some party I hadn't been invited to. And for one long, airless second, I stood there trying to invent a version of the last 3 hours that wouldn't sound like exactly what it was. Library, I said, too fast, and she looked at me for a beat with an expression I couldn't fully read, amusement maybe, or just the mild confusion of someone too tired to interrogate a lie that wasn't actually her business, and said only, at midnight, in that direction, and gestured vaguely toward the English building and the row of apartments beyond it, before shrugging and continuing on toward the dorms without waiting for an answer. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake running the encounter over and over, certain I'd see it repeated back to me somehow, a rumor, a knowing look in the dining hall, a summons to the dean's office. And when nothing came, when Meredith apparently forgot the whole exchange by mourning the way most people forget the small, unremarkable collisions of a late night, I understood something about fear that I hadn't fully understood before. It doesn't need to be confirmed to do its damage. The mere possibility of being seen had cost me a night's sleep and left a permanent, low-grade vigilance in me that never fully switched off again, not for the rest of that year. I told Julian about it the next evening, and he went quiet in that particular way he had, the stillness of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to, and after a long moment he said, "We should talk about what happens if this actually gets out, not as a threat. But so neither of us is blindsided if it does." We spent that night uncharacteristically, not touching each other at all, just talking logistics in low voices at his kitchen table like two people planning for a disaster neither of us wanted to name aloud. What we'd say, what we wouldn't, what it would cost each of us differently, since it would never cost us the same amount. He would lose a position he'd spent years earning. I would lose a scholarship, possibly my standing at the only school I'd ever wanted. We never fully resolved what we'd do. We just agreed in the exhausted, honest hour before I finally fell asleep against his shoulder that we'd rather face it together than have either of us carry it alone. We were more careful after that. Careful enough, in fact, that Priya never followed through on whatever threat had been coiled inside her warning. Whether because she found something better to do with her time, or because some remaining decency in her decided that ruining two people's careers over a jealousy 18 months stale wasn't worth becoming the person who did it, I never learned and never asked. But the fear she'd planted didn't leave. It moved in with us, quiet and permanent, an uninvited third presence in every room we shared from then on. We started checking the street before we kissed goodbye. We started flinching at footsteps on the stairs outside his apartment. The secrecy that had once felt like a shared, thrilling language between us started slowly to feel like a cage we'd built with our own hands and then climbed inside. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone you have to keep hidden, And I don't think anyone warns you about it properly beforehand. It's not the danger itself that wears you down, not exactly. It's the constant low hum of vigilance, the way you're never fully present in a room with other people, because part of you is always managing the story, always checking your own face for anything that might give you away. I started to understand, reading Rebecca again that spring for an entirely different class, why that unnamed narrator spent the whole book waiting for permission to simply exist as herself. I understood it now from the inside. I had built a version of myself that existed only for him, in rooms with locked doors, and a separate, careful, smaller version that existed for everyone else. And by April, I genuinely could not have told you if you'd asked, which one was the real me anymore. It was Julian who said it first, on a night in early May, with finals bearing down on both of us from opposite sides of the desk. We were no longer allowed to share honestly. We were lying in the dark of his apartment, my head on his chest, listening to the laundromat's dryer's thump away below us like a heartbeat that wasn't ours. And he said into the quiet, "I don't want to keep doing this to you." Doing what, I said, already knowing, already dreading it. "Making you disappear," he said. "Making you split yourself into the girl who gets to want me and the girl who has to pretend she doesn't. You deserve better than a life lived in a basement office with the blinds down. You deserve to walk down a street holding someone's hand without doing the math on who might see." "So what are you saying?" I asked, though some part of me already understood, the part of me that had been quietly, achingly waiting for one of us to be brave enough to say it out loud first. "I'm saying I graduate in 3 weeks," he said. "I'm saying the second I'm not your TA anymore, I am done hiding this whatever it costs. But I'm also saying, and I need you to actually hear this part, that if you decide, once you're not risking your entire scholarship for a secret, that you don't want this anymore, that you want to be 21 and unafraid and not tangled up in something that started with this many rules broken, I will let you go, and I will never once make you feel guilty for it." I didn't answer him right away. I lay there against his chest for a long time, listening to the dryers, thinking about all the months I'd spent memorizing which streets to avoid, all the times I'd lied with a straight face to people who loved me, all the danger I'd folded so casually into wanting a person I wasn't supposed to have. And I thought about the version of myself who'd walked into that basement office in September, holding an essay with a B+ on it, who hadn't yet understood that wanting something forbidden and wanting a person can become, over months, indistinguishable from each other, and I thought about whether, given the choice to do it all again, knowing everything I now knew about what it would cost, I would still cross that ugly stretch of linoleum toward him. I would, I said finally, out loud into the dark. Every time. That's the answer to my own question and yours. "Then stay," he said, and it wasn't a question either, not really. It was the sound of a man finally allowing himself to ask for something without immediately apologizing for it. His graduation happened on a bright, ordinary Saturday in late May, the kind of day that makes a campus look like it was never built from anything but gold. I sat in the crowd of parents and siblings and watched him cross a stage in robes that made him look almost like a stranger. And when they called his name, Julian Ashworth, I clapped so hard my palms stung, and no one around me knew, or would ever know, everything folded into that particular sound. We didn't hide it after that. I want you to understand what that felt like, after 9 months of locked doors and separate exits and careful footsteps on old stairs, the sheer, dizzying relief of walking beside him across the quad in daylight, his hand simply, ordinarily laced through mine, nothing underneath it, no second meaning, no careful math of who might see. Priya saw us once, that summer, in a coffee shop near campus, and something crossed her face that might have been anger or might have been something closer to grief for a version of this she'd once wanted for herself. and she said nothing at all, just looked away first, and I understood that whatever she'd once been holding over us, she'd decided, finally, to let it go. I remember the first time I introduced him to my roommate, as more than a name I'd been careful never to say too often. She'd known, of course, the way anyone who loves you eventually knows the shape of a secret, even without the details. And when Julian showed up at our apartment for dinner that June, visibly nervous in a way I'd never once seen him be in a classroom, she hugged him before he'd even finished introducing himself, and said over his shoulder to me, "It's about time I got to actually meet him instead of just hearing about the weather in your texts," which was her polite way of saying she'd known exactly what all those vague, overly careful messages had really meant. Months before I'd worked up the nerve to say it outright, my mother took longer. I told her over the phone in July, sitting on the back porch of my childhood home with the cicadas going full volume around me, and there was a long silence on the other end that I let sit, because I'd decided, walking into that call, that I wasn't going to fill her silence with an apology I didn't actually feel. "He was my TA," I said, when she finally asked the question she was clearly building toward. "It started before he stopped being that. I know how it sounds. I'm telling you anyway, because I'd rather you hear it from me honestly than piece it together later and wonder what else I didn't say." She didn't approve, not fully, not for a long time. I don't think she ever fully let go of the discomfort of the beginning, and I've stopped expecting her to, but she came to our first anniversary dinner that fall, and watched the way he pulled my chair out without seeming to notice he'd done it, and watched the way I laughed at something he said under his breath that no one else at the table caught, and I saw something in her face soften slowly, the particular loosening of a person deciding that whatever else was true, this much at least looked real. I won't tell you it was easy after that, because nothing that starts the way ours did ends up simple just because the hiding stops. There were people at Ravenswood who found out how it began and never quite looked at either of us the same way again. Colleagues of his who made careful, pointed comments at department gatherings. Friends of mine who needed time, real time, to stop flinching at the word grad student in casual conversation. We carried the beginning of our story with us the way you carry any scar, visible, sometimes aching in bad weather, permanently part of the shape of us, whether we liked it or not. But I think about that basement office more often than makes sense, given everything that came after. I think about the exact weight of his shoulder against mine over a page of Turn of the Screw, the radiator clanking its useless heat into a room that felt, that year, like the only honest place either of us had. I think about what he said, that very first office hour, tapping his pen against my hedging paragraph. "You write like someone who's afraid of being caught wanting something." And I think about how right he was, and how long it took me to stop being afraid of it, and how he was the reason, and the risk, and eventually the reward all at once, all tangled together the way the best and worst things in a life so often are. People ask sometimes, carefully, delicately, whether I regret it, the year of lying, the danger we both courted so openly with our eyes wide open, the rule we broke because breaking it felt, at the time, less costly than not knowing what would have happened if we hadn't. I never have a clean answer for them. I think regret assumes there was a version of that year where I got everything I wanted without paying for any of it, and I don't believe that version ever existed. I think some wanting only shows you its whole shape once you've already paid the price of having it. What I'll tell you instead, if you ask, is what he told me once, late, half asleep in that narrow bed above the laundromat, when I asked him if he thought we were being reckless, staying up too late talking about a future neither of us could yet promise the other. He said everyone treats forbidden like it's a warning label. Maybe it's just information. It tells you how much something costs. It doesn't tell you whether it's worth it. Only you get to decide that part. I decided a long time ago. I'd decide it again tonight. If you asked me, in that same basement office, rain against the window, his handwriting crawling through every margin of every book he ever handed me like an argument with the whole world about what he was and wasn't allowed to want. Sometimes, even now, I go back to that copy of Carmilla, the one with his cramped, arguing handwriting still crowding every margin, question marks stacked next to sentences, like he was still hoping the book might finally answer him. I keep it on the shelf nearest our bed, not hidden, not explained to guests who ask about it. Just there, the way the truest parts of a story are never the ones you tell loudly. Every so often I open it to a random page and read his old commentary against the text. And I think about the version of me who first read those margins at 20, terrified and thrilled in equal measure, underlining a paragraph so hard the pen nearly tore the page, not yet understanding that the boy writing in the margins of a 150-year-old novel about forbidden wanting was, in his own careful, hedging way, writing to me the whole time. I think, if I'm honest, that's what this story has always really been about. Not the rule we broke, though we broke it thoroughly, and not the danger, though the danger was real and cost us both more sleep than either of us likes to admit. It's about the specific, terrifying work of learning to stop hedging, of finally writing the unhedged sentence, the one that says plainly what you want instead of dressing it up as curiosity or coincidence or academic interest, and then living with the consequences of having said it out loud. He taught me that in a basement office before he ever touched me, and I don't think either of us understood, that September afternoon, how literally I'd end up learning the lesson. People still ask, sometimes, whether it was worth it. The secrecy, the fear, the year we spent building an entire second language just to be near each other safely. I used to try to answer that question honestly, weighing the cost against the reward like a ledger that might actually balance. I don't do that anymore. Some things were never meant to be totaled up that way. You don't ask whether a fire was worth the burn. You only ask whether, given the choice again, knowing everything, you'd still reach toward the warmth. I would. I did. I'm telling you this story instead of keeping it locked in a basement office with the blinds drawn, because I decided a long time ago that I was done being the narrator who waits for permission to exist in the present tense. This is mine, all of it, the risk, the rules we broke, the two versions of myself I had to become to survive that year, and the one version I finally got to keep. Mine to tell, mine to have wanted. Mine at last without a single hedge left in the sentence. That's the story. That's how it started and how it very nearly ended, and how, against every rule either of us had ever been handed, it didn't end at all. Make of it what you will. I've made my peace with what it makes of me. I hope, wherever you are listening to this, in the dark, in a car, in a bed that isn't quite big enough for the thoughts keeping you up, I hope you find whatever it is you've been hedging around, too, and I hope, when you finally write the unhedged sentence, someone is there in the margins, waiting to write one back.